I want to talk about Angular forms and comparing the way you can do Angular forms. And the reason why I want to talk about this is I think for most of the applications you're building, you'll use a form. Either it's the login form or it's the contact form. Forms are a way to get data from your users. And there's a few ways you can do that in Angular. Sadly, if you go to the Angular documentation, it's not really well at explaining when you should choose one over the other, or how do you compare the two. It just says there's two ways of doing forms. And the ways you can do forms in Angular, the template forms and the reactive forms. They both live in the Angular forms module. One of them you import out of it the forms module, and the other one you import the reactive forms module. And the reason there's two of them is one's the easy way, one's the smart way. They diverge in philosophy, in programming style and technique. They look the same at the end for the user, but one of them is easier for you to develop. The other one is easier for your whole team to use later. We're going to talk about template forms first. So in terms of template forms, are useful for adding simple form to an app, like email list sign up, maybe the login one, if it's not 7 fields deep. That's the reason I'd use them. They're easy to add to the app, but they don't scale. As soon as you need to change it or reuse it, good luck with that. If it's basic, you can go with this. They have two parts. There's a component class and an HTML-based template. And they kind of are tightly coupled together, so there's not a lot of reusability in between. The component class looks a bit like this, where you have to define everything you're going to use in the form, in the model. So for me, I'm going to do the classic example of a hero, where you have like powers. There's a model where you can create a new hero. There's a submitted flag, and then there's a non-submit handler that says, okay, this form was submitted. The HTML-based template, this is where things get heavy and complicated. If you look at my HTML, I've got a label and an input. So my input field has like 4 lines of HTML just to define everything. So I've got like an ID that I need. I've got validation. And I need to bind my model for each of the inputs to the model by hand. And I need to do that every time I use a field. If I want to use something complicated, for example, a select instead of an input with the option, I have to write a lot of template logic to make it work. So I have to bind my model to the select object. I have to generate my option by hand every time and make sure everything kind of sticks together. One of the reasons this is easy, it's like this is the simple way to add a form, because you don't have to understand how Angular works. You have to do an HTML form and then put in some Angular sprinkles on top. As opposed to the reactive forms where you have to understand Angular, and then Angular does a bunch of magic to your form, this goes a bit different. So we're going to look at 4 things when it comes to all of these forms. We're going to look at how you build one, how you do change detection on them, how you do validations on them, including custom validations. So when you want to do, because it's all in the template, when you want to do change detection, you're kind of screwed. Change detection on template forms happens via CSS classes. Like, whenever something happens to your form, the CSS attached to it changes. When the control has been visited, it's ng touched and it's untouched when you begin with. When you change the value of it, it turns to dirty from ng pristine. And when the control value is valid, it turns to ng valid versus ng invalid. And that's your change detection in template forms. That's it. You rely on template. One of the reasons templates template forms are not scalable is because all your logic resides in the template. You've seen my component. My component has no logic whatsoever. It just has the model in it, and that's about it. What happens if I want to validate? What happens if I want to say, right, if this field needs to be required or have 4 characters or stuff like that? You're still down to CSS. So you can target the CSS classes like ngValid and required, and you can add some sort of CSS to it, styles. And if it's invalid, you can add, again, CSS to it. But that means if I really want to bypass your form, I can open up the dev tools and submit it that way. There's no client-side validation in my JavaScript logic. Everything happens via CSS. And you kind of trust your users to behave and do a lot of CSS in between so you can notify the user when something goes wrong. If you want to have custom validation isn't happening. You're down to HTML validation. Like the required attribute is something from the HTML input element. You've got min length and max length and a bunch of other things, but you're limited to that. Let's look at how error handling happens. So if I change my field to be as heavy as I can make it, I can say, right, so we're gonna have a hidden field that's only hidden when the name is valid and the name is pristine, and otherwise we're gonna say the name is required. And it still happens with a lot of template logic and a lot of HTML and CSS baked into it. So this is the 4 things we looked at forms. Change detection, validation, how we build them, and error handling. And in terms of template forms, if you want to build with this, sure. What happens when I have a 7-part form? What happens when I have a questionnaire? I'll have to manually code. I think I'm already down. So this is one field that has everything in it. I have to redo this for every field in my form, which is not really easy to do or scalable. So that's why Angular has a different module called Reactive Forms. They're more robust, they're more scalable, reusable, and testable. When you want to test out your template forms, you're down to actually generating the element or the component on the page and then testing that. With Reactive Forms, you can test the logic underneath without having to actually put the component on screen. If forms are a key part of your application, and if you're already using reactive patterns in your app, you should use Reactive Forms. The Reactive Forms has an API that looks a bit like this. There's abstract control, form group, form array, and the one at the bottom that you can barely see, that's there for a reason, it's called Form Builder, which is basically a different way of creating reactive forms. The abstract control is kind of a base class that has everything. The form control is a superclass of abstract control. And form group and array is just a way of grouping form controls. You can either put them in a group or an array that's self-passing or whatever. Let's look at how it actually looks in Angular. So we've got the hero component compared to the other one where you had all your model logic or all your model and nothing Angular related. This actually has, right, I have a new form group and with 2 form controls. And this is how you define your form instead of having to worry about the model. Now, if you're using the directive versus reactive forms, you have to keep updating the model with the template. So when something changes in the template, it goes to the model, but when something changes in the model, you have to do all that loop for yourself. Reactive forms, because of this, work on their own. If you want to look at the HTML that accompanies that form, it's a lot cleaner. You can actually understand what's happening there. So it's an input which you bind to the form control name, and that's it. Instead of having 12 lines of HTML for an element, you're down to 3 or 2, whatever, you're down to a lot less. If you have multiple form controls, you want to register them with the parent form group. This is simple to do. The thing I have in there is actually at the top. It says, right, I've got a form group called hero form, and then I have this form controls underneath them. I was talking about form builder. One of the reasons I'm not a fan of form control and form group is I keep having to say new, 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 new every time. I think when I create a bigger form, I've got like 12 new instances of form group or form control. So the form builder is an abstraction layer on top that actually says, right, when I construct my component, I'm getting the form builder instance, and then with the form builder instance, I can use a declarative approach that says, I want my form to be a group, and inside the group, I've got this form controls as an object. Now, each form control has 2 parameters in there. For now, I'm only using one, which basically means initial state. And the second one is an optional argument which takes validators in. So for example, if I want to do validation for this one, I have to pass in a validator. It's either a validator function or an array of validator functions. Now, a bunch of validators come in with the validators module in forms, and those map one-to-one to your HTML validators. So for example, validators required is going to do the same as having required on your input field. Min length is going to do the same thing, but, and here's the kicker, you can have your own custom validators on top of it. Validators have to be pure functions, but for me, I put in a forbidden name validator that I wrote myself that says, no hero should be called Bob. Is any Bob in the audience? Okay, I tried to pick a safe name. Right, so what I did here is I kept all my logic in my component instead of in my template. Even validations are in my component instead of being in my template. If you want to write your own custom validators, it has to be a pure function. So it's type validator function, and it takes in a regular expression, and it returns a pure value. It has nothing to do with Angular in the function. It's just pure JavaScript. And the function I built is actually factory. So whenever I use it, I'm using a new instance of it based on the regular expression. So I can have unlimited validators that way. So we saw how validation works. And when you compare it to template forms, it already gives you an advantage. And that's custom validation, which you can't really do with the other one. What happens when you want to do change tracking? I think this is where reactive forms kind of win it for me overall, even if everything else stayed the same. The fact that I could use the form control value changes observer and ng on changes is what makes it worth it for me. So the form control value changes actually works on all of the reactive forms, APIs. So I can say when this group changed, or when this just tiny control changed, I want to be notified. And that means I can subscribe to my observer, and as change happens, I can do stuff with it. I can validate on type in instead of having to validate with CSS at the end of it. And the ng on changes works a bit different. ng on changes works on the entire form instead of just one tiny part. So for example, for me, when I have a form that's all required, I do ng on changes. Or when I have a form that has logic on the type of right. So if you've had this, let's say where do you live? Malaysia. If you live in Malaysia, I have an extra question for you. ng on changes is what I use because my form changed, and I can actually replug back into my reactive form and say, hey, I've changed my mind. This isn't my form anymore. Add this group at the end of it. And that's how I do it. When I just want to validate that your email address is correct, or whatever, it's an email address, I do the value changes observer. Or when I want to use your email straight away, I do that. So if you look at the two things I showed you, reactive forms and template forms, what's the actual difference between them? And the differences are pretty huge. In reactive forms, you create your entire form control tree in code. You can immediately update the value or drill down through the descendants of the parent form because all controls are always available. In template-driven forms, they delegate the creation of the form controls to directives. To avoid change after checked errors, these directives take more than one cycle to build the entire control tree. And that means you have to wait a tick before manipulating any of the controls from within the component class. And I feel like that is where most of the template form get tricky to use, because no one kind of waits around and says, hey, have you actually ticked? And they try to change some value in the form right away, and that's when the errors happen. On top of that, the reactive forms are structured in terms of a data model. Everything kind of lives in that one form, the group, the control, everything. Whereas the if you remember the template forms, my model was all over the place. It was basically a bunch of properties in my class, and I had to figure out what was in what. In terms of predictability, reactive forms are synchronous, and you control everything about them. Whereas template forms, because Angular takes over from you, they're asynchronous, and you can never know if this happened or not. In terms of the form validation, functions are validators inside of reactive forms, but the template one are directives. Now, if you want to be pedantic with me, you could actually argue that inside of a template form, if I want custom validators, I could write my own custom directive to validate my form. What do you think? How easy is that compared to just writing a function? In terms of mutability, the reactive forms are immutable, whereas the template-driven are mutable. And that means data changes in template forms, whereas my data never changes in reactive forms. In terms of scalability, the template-driven forms are an abstraction. You never have access to the working of it. You kind of hand it off to Angular, and you pray, because it's Angular magic. In terms of the reactive forms, you actually have access, and you work with the low-level APIs, so you can hook into those anytime you need something. I feel like if you're going to make a decision today about what type of form to use, you kind of have to think, where will my form be used tomorrow? I think one of the biggest issues I have with forms, so I used to work in a company where we only did components for other teams. And you think, oh, I need the contact form. And that was the easiest thing to build in template-driven forms, because it's 5 fields. And you always think 5 fields is, I don't need that much work for 5 fields, until you have 6 versions of the contact form, depending on where it's used in which of the multi mini applications. And when we rewrote the entire component library, thank God for that, we ended up going with the reactive form that went, I can work with contact data. It doesn't really matter what contact data you have. As long as it maps to my contact data type, I can create 1,000 of them that look slightly different, work the same, because I can reuse my form component. I think that was my small pitch, trying to compare the Angular forms, because I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. I'm going to finish here. I've got one small ask for you. Actually, there's 2. So one of them is, I'm trying to do some research around the area and how developers interact with technology and content around here. So I've got this link over there that says nexmo.dev/ngmi. it's a form. I basically want you to fill out the form. To say thank you at the end of it, you get 10 euros or 46 ringgit. I think that's it, 46 ringgit worth of credit to play on the platform as a thank you for filling out the form. And the second ask I have, no, I'm not going to ask you to follow me on Twitter. That was Sebastian yesterday. I don't think it worked out for him. My second ask is I want to take a selfie with you on stage, but here's the kicker. You kind of have to look like you enjoyed my talk if my boss is checking my Twitter. You know, like we had a good time and I wasn't boring you for 25 minutes. Let's try this. Hands in the air, you know, like you have fun. Okay, that's good, that's good. And with that, really, terima kasih.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. That's a very accurate pronunciation.